Hi, everyone. I'm really honored to be asked to introduce Joel, and it's my pleasure. First of all, because at the CCPA we really treasure our partnership with the Columbia Institute, we're partners together in the Climate Justice Project that you've heard about over the years, and we are partners together along with Genius in Next Up, the youth leadership program that brings many of the young people here who are here tonight and who are hot on your heels as the next generation of leaders, current leaders. So I've been invited to introduce Joel, and it's my huge pleasure because I have been such an admirer of his work for so many years. Joel is a professor of law at the University of British Columbia. He's a former Rhodes Scholar with degrees from Oxford and Dalhousie and Harvard. But the thing that I most appreciate about Joel isn't his distinguished academic career and all the academic writing that he's done. Joel really epitomizes the model of a public intellectual. Joel is somebody who is engaged. He's not just in the ivory tower. He writes popularly. He does media commentary. He's much sought after as a teacher and as a public speaker, and for reasons that you will be about to see. For many of us, I think Joel first came to people's attention as the author of the book *The Corporation*, which was really, well, the book was the basis for the movie *The Corporation*, and he partnered with the documentary filmmaker Mark Akbar to create this film that I'm pretty sure most people in this room have seen. And really that partnership of the film and the book were hugely successful at popularizing an idea, namely this idea of the corporation as a sociopath. But more than that, the idea that the corporations are legally programmed to create wealth without responsibility, and that had profound impacts on our democracy. And then more recently, in his new book, Joel has applied that thesis of the corporation to our children. In his new book, Childhood Under Siege, How Big Business Targets Children, which looks at the role of marketers and the pharmaceutical industry and child labor and the corporatization of our schools, and is a real eye-opener for any of us with children and in the education system. He lives in Vancouver with his partner and 2 children. He is also, just as an aside, a jazz guitarist and will in fact be, for those of you in the Vancouver area, will be playing at the Jazz Cellar on April 29th, along with his wife, who is singing. His wife is a musician and a very well-known Canadian actor named Rebecca Jenkins, and they will be performing together. Please join me in welcoming Joel Bakan.
Thank you. Thank you, fellow travelers on the road to social justice and sustainability. Thank you, Charlie. Thank you, Seth. Thank you, Christine. Thank you, Columbia Institute. It's really, truly an honor to be a part of this exciting, this important conference. And I have to say, this is a pretty beautiful setting, and it's an appropriate setting. I mean, it's stressful these days, fighting the good fight, often up against mean-spirited and painfully short-sighted and small-minded opponents, like those responsible for yesterday's federal budget. So I think we deserve a trip to the spa. And I have to say for myself, for me personally, it's kind of nice for a change to actually want to get myself into hot water, which I plan to do after dinner. Now, as I was driving up here, and I'm sure some of you saw this, there are signs on the way up to Harrison Hot Springs saying that we're in Sasquatch country, which got me thinking about monsters, which got me thinking about beasts, and then because my mind usually finds the political angle of whatever happens to be floating through it, the phrase "starve the beast" was irresistible. Starve the beast is what I want to talk about tonight. As you may know, this is a term that's used to describe a strategy, indeed an entire approach to politics and policy that dominates right-wing and increasingly mainstream politics and thought today. And though the term originates in the United States, I think it's painfully operative in Canada today. I think we've seen evidence of it yesterday in that federal budget. And the notion is this, and I think it's really important to put it on the table and name it for what it is, because this is what's going on. The notion is that you roll back taxes, especially on corporations and the wealthy. You create fiscal crises and deficits. That in turn justifies cutting the budgets of publicly funded programs and agencies. The programs and agencies, starved of adequate funding, can't help but fail. They don't have the resources, or at least perform poorly. And their failures and poor performances are then marshaled as evidence that public institutions don't work, that they're inefficient and they're deficient. And the solution then, the rabbit out of the hat, is to get rid of those public institutions, or at least diminish their operations, and then hand over their responsibilities to private providers, usually for-profit corporations. It's a brilliant strategy. It's working, unfortunately. Starve the beast. And it's brilliant as long as you don't think about it too hard. Because if you do think about it, even just a little bit, you realize that its logic is kind of illogical. Sort of like blaming a car for not running if it runs out of gas, or blaming a person for getting tired and ill if you starve them of food. But logic, it seems, is not that highly valued in right-wing circles today. In fact, it usually attracts suspicion and hostility, which is why I think, and it's the only explanation I can come up with, why starve the beast strategies have been so successful and so powerful, despite their inherent illogicity. Take education. Our government here in British Columbia has made no secret of the fact that it disdains teachers' collective bargaining rights, that it's happy to trample all over those rights, even if that means trampling all over our Constitution and all over our international treaty obligations. Now, my fear is that these maneuvers are not just some isolated problem, but they're part of a larger attack, and I think many of you will share this, part of a larger attack on public education. And when I look south of the border, where starve the beast attacks on education are currently rampant, those fears are heightened. Over the last 30 years in the United States, public schools, especially those in inner city and poor districts, have been starved adequate funding. They've deteriorated as a result. The system is now in crisis. Everybody, right, left, center, agrees that the system is in crisis. But if you listen to mainstream media and most school reform advocates in the United States today, the reason behind the crisis is not chronic underfunding, but rather supposedly unaccountable, greedy, and incompetent teachers. It's almost blood sport today in the United States to attack teachers, and inefficient public systems. And if you listen a bit further, the solution that's always proposed is to make schools run more like businesses. That's what they need. So you need market incentives for teachers. You need to fire underperforming teachers. You need to close schools that aren't performing well. And you need to ensure that more schools are actually run by businesses, by what are called EMOs, Education Management Organizations. In the spring of 2008, a symposium was held at Chicago's exclusive Mid-America Club to celebrate the first years of the city's school reform program called Renaissance 2010. The name of the symposium, Free to Choose, Free to Succeed, the New Market of Public Education, captured its animating idea that public schools should be governed by private sector values. Arne Duncan, then head of the Chicago school system, he had changed his title, by the way, from school superintendent to CEO. Arne Duncan was the symposium's star attraction. We're trying to blur the lines between the public and the private, he told the audience, mainly representatives from corporations, right-wing think tanks, and school privatization groups. I am not a manager of 600 schools, he said. I'm a portfolio manager of 600 schools, and I'm trying to improve the portfolio. Now, while Duncan had overseen Renaissance 2010, he had handed over the detailed drafting of the plan to the Commercial Club of Chicago, the voice of the city's business elite. And that organization had declared that its aim was nothing short of reshaping Chicago's school system to reflect a, quote, private sector perspective, close quote. 60 schools were closed, 100 new ones were opened in their place. The new schools were all run by private organizations, including for-profit companies, and unlike the schools they replaced, none of them had unions. The overarching effect of Renaissance 2010 was to transform a quintessentially public institution, public schooling, into a market-driven partnership with business. Now, unfortunately, this approach is not isolated to Chicago. It's now become the model for the entire United States. Indeed, President Obama's national education policy, called Race to the Top, incorporates most of the key elements of Renaissance 2010, which I suppose really isn't much of a surprise, given that the person President Obama chose as his Secretary of Education was none other than Chicago's Arne Duncan. Now, what is going on in the U.S., and we should always, I think, especially in this province with our current government, be concerned about what's going on down there because our conservative and right-wing governments read from the same playbooks, sometimes using different language. What is going on in U.S. schools is a classic starve the beast strategy. Tax cuts lead to revenue crunches lead to underfunding of schools, underfunding causes dysfunction, crowded classrooms, broken down buildings and furniture, too few and burned out teachers and staff, outdated textbooks and materials. Dysfunctions make it difficult, if not impossible, for teachers to teach and for students to learn, and inevitably schools fail. But it's not inadequate funding that's blamed, it's teachers, and it's their unions, and it's the fact that the public school system is public rather than run by market principles. And it's not better funding that's proposed as a solution, it's privatization. It's more industry and corporate involvement, more market-driven incentives and sanctions. And not surprisingly, the main backers and proponents of all of this come from the ranks of big business. Indeed, the person at the helm of this market-driven school reform movement is none other than Bill Gates. There are huge amounts of money to be made by for-profit companies in an area, public schooling, that historically they've been excluded from, and now they want a piece of it. Actually, they want all of it. Unimaginably vast is how Benno Schmidt Jr., a major player in the education industry who I interviewed for the corporation, unimaginably vast is how he describes the new market in education. Education is bigger, he says, than defense, bigger than the whole domestic auto industry. Only healthcare has a larger segment of the American marketplace. End of quote. So corporations can and they currently do make money, lots of money from schools. More schools are being run in the U.S. by these publicly traded companies, EMOs, like HMOs, education management organizations. And for-profit companies are becoming increasingly involved in training teachers, providing standardized tests and curricula, wiring schools with hardware and software, providing food, janitorial, transportation, security service. All of these create a huge market. Only healthcare is larger in the US, and one growing rapidly, especially because of these starve the beast strategies. Okay, by the way, this talk's going to have a happy ending. Just want you to know that. And one related to the theme of the conference. I make it all work. But I want to, before getting there, I want to shift gears a little bit. And I want to make the point that starve the beast strategies aren't limited to public services like education. They extend as well to the public regulatory system. Deep funding cuts to regulatory agencies are increasingly common. Yesterday's federal budget basically destroyed 20,000 public sector jobs. Many of those are in regulatory agencies that are aimed at protecting important public interests. And the inevitable effect of the cuts is to make it difficult and sometimes impossible for agencies to do their jobs effectively. The agencies are then criticized and denigrated for being ineffective and inefficient, just like the schools that have been defunded. Classic starve the beast strategy. And the solution, again, we're told, is to privatize. But it's a little bit different here. In this case, what happens is you privatize regulation by deregulating, rolling it back, and saying we can trust corporations to regulate themselves. Self-regulation, it's the latest craze. Corporate social responsibility, corporations can be trustworthy. When I interviewed Samir Jabara, he was then the former chair and he was then the chair and CEO of Goodyear Tire. And he put it this way. He described this tendency that we're seeing. He said, corporations need to become more trustworthy because there has been a transfer of authority from the government to the corporation. And the corporation needs to assume that responsibility and needs to really behave as a corporate citizen of the world, needs to assume the self-discipline that in the past governments required from it. End of quote. Well, this presumes, of course, that corporations can be trustworthy and that corporate trustworthiness can be a substitute for public regulation. That's a fantasy, at best, in light of the profoundly self-interested, as I talked about elsewhere, psychopathic institutional nature of the corporation. There's a fellow named Willem Buter. He's the chief economist at Citigroup and also an academic, and I think he puts it best in terms of this self-regulation craze. He says, self-regulation stands in relation to regulation the way self-importance stands in relation to importance, and self-righteousness, you get the rest, stands in relation to righteousness. Okay. So my larger point here, and what I want to return to now, is that whether we're talking about public services such as schools, or we're talking about the public regulatory system, as I've just been describing, starve the beast strategies are devastating the capacity of public institutions to protect and promote public goods and interests. And this, I believe, creates fundamental problems for us on the left. Historically, we, as social democrats, as democratic socialists, have believed that democratic governments can and should play a positive and proactive role in meeting public needs and serving public interests. That's a point I don't think I have to argue for in this room tonight. But the last 30 years of deregulation, of privatization, of slashing of public services, of increasingly cozy relationships among governments and industry, and of course, starve the beast strategies, all of this has had the effect of turning the hero of our story, government, into a villain, or at least an accomplice of villains. So there's a lot of legitimate distrust of governments today on the left, a sense that they have become part of the problem and they are no longer part of the solution. And what that means is that the very people and constituencies who should and would be fighting for progressive governance have turned to other places to do their politics, to the streets and social media, as with the Occupy movement, or to non-governmental organizations, or even to the corporate social responsibility movement. People have lost faith in government. So while the right distrusts government because it threatens to restrain capital, the left distrusts government because capital restrains it. And the net result, no one trusting government, is, of course, a complete victory for corporations and industry, whose best interests have always lain with distrusted and therefore weak and ineffective governments. And that victory for corporations and industry is, I don't need to tell you, a defeat for our aspirations as social democrats and democratic socialists. Creating a good and just society necessarily requires commitment to certain values and social goods that can only be realized through the robust and proactive initiatives of robust public institutions. Democratic governance, civil and political rights, good jobs, reasonable income, social equality, environmental protection, workers' rights, clean water, shelter, food, all of these are necessary building blocks for a society where people can shape their destinies, where they can lead full and healthy lives. For corporations, for industry, for markets, these values and social goods have no intrinsic worth. They may be superficially endorsed in public relations and social responsibility campaigns. They'll just as likely be vigorously opposed, at least behind closed doors, when they demand policies and practices that clash with corporate interests. In the end, democratic governments, whatever else may be said of them, are really the only institutions we have now, and I'm not a utopian. I want to know what to do tomorrow and the next day. They're the only institutions we have in our current society that have the authority, legitimacy, and mandate to set and enforce publicly oriented rules, standards, and policies that are necessary to create good and just societies. To the extent we abandon governments, to the extent we distrust them rather than working to make them trustworthy, we abandon our hope for creating a good and a just society. So the question is, of course, what do we do? And at the most basic level, what I believe we need to do is restore the legitimacy and the practice of public democratic governance. We need to revitalize the ideas and the practices of citizenship. We need to re-embrace the rights and the duties of collective stewardship that citizenship entails. And that is a long way of getting to the topic of this conference, which is that the future is local. Because local government, I believe, is a key site, perhaps the key site, for restoring people's faith in democratic governance as the primary vehicle for protecting and promoting the public interest. It's the localness of local governments that I believe puts them in unique positions to bolster democracy, and in particular, social democracy. No other level of government can similarly combine people's tangible sense of what they need in their immediate communities with the public and democratic exercise of state power. And no other political community is similarly composed of citizens who quite literally live with and amongst each other, who share and care about the same physical space, the same physical environment, and who can easily come together and address issues of common concern. When, to take an example, and there are many, and each of you who works in this area will have an example, but this is a nice example. In 2007, citizens in Sao Paulo, Brazil, one of the world's largest cities, had had enough with the blight and overly commercialized environment created by excessive billboard advertising. So through their municipal government, they banned all commercial advertising in public space. It's a ban that's still in place today, 5 years later, and it's supported, according to a poll last year, by 70% of the population. The city looks unlike any other city. It is just devoid of any commercial detritus. It's a fascinating thing to see. Closer to home, when I recently asked Philip Owen, who I bumped into, why, as a mayor, he had been so passionate about creating a safe injection site in Vancouver. I mean, here's a guy whose every moral and political instinct would seem to go in the opposite direction. But what he told me was that when he saw the needless suffering and illness in Vancouver's downtown east side, when he heard the stories and perspectives of those who lived there and those who worked with drug users, he simply could not ignore the obvious, namely that a safe injection site was needed and that it would do a world of good and save lives and improve lives. There is something about being rooted in the local. I don't think Philip Owen, if he was in Victoria or Ottawa, would have been so passionately committed to creating a safe injection site. There's something about being rooted in the local, where people's political communities are composed of their actual lived communities. There's something about that which, for both citizens and politicians, makes it harder to ignore realities of injustice, of suffering, of degraded environments. In local politics, the people that we so often hear about when we're talking about democracy is not some philosophical abstraction. It's not some geographically dispersed idea. It's the actual folks you're living with. And that makes local politics unique. So to take another example, San Francisco, November 2nd, 2010, the Board of Supervisors, the city's legislative body, votes by an 8-3 margin to ban fast food restaurants from giving away toys with children's meals. There's a lot of social scientific evidence that shows that this is a particularly manipulative pull. I mean, it's obvious, free toys, you know? It's a particularly manipulative pull. So they ban it. And the ban, which among other things, makes the sale of McDonald's Happy Meals illegal, which McDonald's is very unhappy about, was lobbied for, initiated, and justified as a measure to combat a spiraling child obesity crisis. November 5th, 3 days after the vote, San Francisco's mayor at the time, Gavin Newsom, announces he will veto the law. He doesn't like it because it inserts government in a place that only parents should be in terms of making decisions. The veto is then overturned by a supermajority of the Board of Supervisors, and the law prevails. And that's because the members of the board, contrary to the mayor, contrary to McDonald's, who complained that the law denied parents' freedoms, the Board of Supervisors believed that the ban actually promoted parental choice and promoted parental freedom by countering a powerful source of pressure on parents to buy unhealthy food for their kids. Now, the concrete and the tangible effects of local initiatives, like San Francisco's toy giveaway law, like Vancouver's Insight, like Sao Paulo's billboard law, like 100 other initiatives that many of you have been involved with in your local governments, in your local communities, the concrete and tangible effects of these measures are undoubtedly important. But they have another kind of effect as well, a symbolic effect. And I believe that that effect is equally, if not more important, than whatever concrete benefits they may yield. When we see local governments engaged in active, progressive initiatives, what we're seeing are tangible, actual realizations of democracy's potential, of what democracy can do, of what can happen when the power of the people is actually harnessed to the authority of the state. So another inspiring example is, and again, it's from the US, and it's something that I just wrote something about, which is why I want to talk about it, in a book that's coming out in about a month called the Occupy Handbook, which is a collection of essays by about 35 people involved in the movement and others, Paul Krugman, Chris Hedges, Barbara Ehrenreich, others. It's a very cool book. Not that I'm plugging it. But this is a very interesting example. There's a growing movement among civic governments in the United States to pass resolutions condemning the Supreme Court's recent decision, which you may have heard of in a case called Citizens United, that grants unlimited rights to corporations to make electoral campaign contributions. So it basically bars Congress from restricting, placing a cap on the amount that corporations can contribute to the political process. Now, needless to say, this is a hit on democracy. It gives big business even more leverage over the political process than it already had. But the people are fighting back, and the really interesting thing is that they're fighting back through their local governments. Though civic governments lack authority to overturn a Supreme Court decision, only a constitutional amendment can do that, they have nonetheless become the official voices of popular opposition to the court's decision. They've aligned themselves with the Occupy movement, they've aligned themselves with other activist groups, and they are supporting a proposed constitutional amendment by the only socialist senator in the United States, Bernard Sanders, to basically override this decision of the Supreme Court. Their actions are purely symbolic. There is no concrete to their actions because they have no jurisdiction over the issue. But they're of crucial importance nonetheless. They show how local governments can be activist, how they can form alliances with activist groups. And it's not just a few small towns in the state of Vermont, you know, dog bites person. Vermont is always doing these sorts of things, and there are 24 cities in the state of Vermont have passed these resolutions. But there are 150 cities across the United States that have done this, including New York, Los Angeles, Pittsburgh, Portland, Orlando, not just small cities and towns. It's an inspiring movement, and one that, along with all the other examples that I've looked at and the many others that all of you could bring up and that you've been involved with, these examples underline my point here, that in both concrete and symbolic ways, local governments can play crucial roles in bolstering democracy. So let me conclude briefly by saying that as a society, we are really at a crossroads. We're facing a choice between, on the one hand, continuing to weaken our public governance systems, continuing to privatize, continuing to depend more and more on corporations to govern themselves, versus the other hand, which is the other choice, which is revitalizing our democratic governance, bringing it closer to its justifying ideals, making it more effective, making it better able to protect the public interests that it's meant to protect. And I think we, at least in this room, can all agree that the latter scenario is where we want to end up. And I believe, as I've suggested, that local governments are uniquely situated to help us get there. So I want to thank all of you in this room who likely collectively have been involved in hundreds of local initiatives promoting social justice, promoting social welfare, promoting sustainability. Your work could not be more important, it could not be more timely, and it may, on the basis of what I've been saying tonight, it may end up being the salvation of democracy itself. So thank you very much for that, and thank you for listening to me tonight.